Well, welcome everybody to another edition of Broker Power Hour. We are now one day past the election results and about 2.5 months past the implementation of the practice changes. And while at least my take on this is that most people are um, getting the hang of it and that there haven't been a lot of issues, I think what we wanted to do at MAR was just to open up the Power Hour once again, the last one of the year, as I understand it, for questions that may come up. And by the way, it's not really a big deal, but I don't know that people can see me, but maybe that's not a problem. But anyway, so kind of the goal today is to, I'm gonna provide a brief information on, just some of the things I've been hearing over the course of the past couple of months. And then we're really gonna open it up for questions for those of you that are now joined on the call to ask. And as Karin indicated, the best way to do that is through the Q&A as opposed to the chat link. So please use Q&A. And, if it's a question that is just too difficult to type or perhaps too long to type and just requires some verbal explanation, that is fine as well. So let me get started. So, like I said, I think things are starting to settle down, but we are now entering into or now have entered into a new era unlike what most of us have ever seen before. And, as I've said probably numerous times, you're probably sick of me hearing it. I think what, MAR members generally need to do and realtors across the country is to just kind of start focusing in on that inherent skill set that y'all possess. Things like creativity, objectivity, and by objectivity, I mean, not simply relying on the way things used to be done because we're no longer in the way things used to be done. And then critical thinking and analysis. And I think people also have to be open to new ideas. We're starting to see, new business models, both in Montana and around the country, some new ways of doing things, out of concern for perhaps, continued, I don't want to say investigations, but research and communications from governmental agencies, including the Department of Justice. So I think people just have to be move a little bit slower and be a little bit more open to things being a little bit different than they used to be, if not a lot different. I know we are now pretty certain, if not absolutely certain. I haven't really looked at the news since about 5:30 this morning of a new administration coming in. Exactly how that will impact the future investigations of the Department of Justice in general, and as to the realtor organization specifically, is to be determined. My personal opinion is that it probably will have some effect. I think most people thought it would have some effect regardless of who won. I think with the Republican administration now apparently taking the White House in January, that will be more pronounced, but that's again to be determined. So what's happening right now? Well, the things that I'm hearing are situations where sellers want flexibility in how they're going to pay any compensation that they may be agreeable to paying. Things like, well, I want to know what the offer is before I will agree to a set amount. If it's a good offer, I may be willing to pay more. If it's an offer that is below what I would hope to be receiving, I might want to pay less. You've got other sellers who are situations where agents and or agencies are not willing to pay or accept agent to agent compensation. And how do you deal with that? And then on the buyer side, some of the things that I mainly hear are just the difficulty in having the conversation, which admittedly we've never had to have with buyers about compensation at the very outset of the relationship. And especially with those buyers who may have a difficult time in affording compensation that in addition to the costs incurred that they will incur in, for most of them, as you all know, one of the largest expenditures they'll ever have in their lifetime. And I do, by the way, I'm not going to focus strictly on the NAR stuff. I do want to mention a couple of other things that I think are important that came up unrelated to NAR, including a recent court case out of Carbon County from a month ago. a little over a month ago. But some of the things that I'm hearing, as I indicated, still questions is, seller flexibility is one of them. How to maintain, or how to address sellers who want to be flexible in their compensation. I think the key point here, and the key point of some of these practice changes and the communications we've had from NAR is, within the bounds of what is legally permissible, you've got to be you've got to do what the seller wants as far as how to structure their compensation and follow their instructions. NAR not that long ago, I don't know the exact date, kind of released, and I'd recommend everybody review it if you haven't already on the FAQ or the Realtor.Facts website. Do's and don'ts when representing buyers and sellers. There's one for buyers, one for sellers, and I'm gonna quote or mention a couple of them from that NAR release here within the past couple of weeks. But on the listing side, you've got to follow the instructions of the seller when it comes to communicating offers of compensation. Sellers may want the buyer's agent to initiate, or may not want, I'm sorry, the buyer to initiate negotiation on the amount of compensation before disclosing the amount authorized. But you also can't necessarily withhold information about compensation when the seller has instructed you to make an offer known, other than on the MLS, which obviously you're prohibited from doing. So you really need to sit down and have a conversation with your seller about how do they want to handle compensation, if they want to offer compensation at all. Is it something that's going to be determined on a case-by-case basis? Do they want you disclosing the information about what they're authorized to pay if they've authorized something initially, or do they want the buyer to, or buyer agent to submit something before you disclose what that is? And kind of I'd say the sky's the limit, probably a little bit too broad, but as long as it's lawful, the instructions of your seller are going to be paramount in deciding how you're going to handle that compensation. Some other things that come up, and some of this, by the way, just so everybody knows, the MAR Form Subcommittee met 2 weeks ago yesterday. I think it was October 22nd. And while the date you'll see some additional form changes is somewhat unknown, because that's dependent a little bit upon how quickly our form vendors can get those updates made. We're trying to move quickly and hope that maybe we'd even have those available by the end of the year. I'll discuss some of the things that you'll see, but one of them is going to be, because this question comes up a lot, how to handle situations where you may have a temporary agent on the buyer side that you want to involve in assisting in showing the homes. And one of the things we've decided to do, exactly how it's going to look, is still to be determined, because I've got to work out the language. But for that situation where you might be a buyer agent team, you might have 2-3 agents who might be working with a particular buyer given the day, how to do that. And generally that would be including them in the buyer representation agreement, or licensed assistants, how to handle that situation where you might have assistants who might offer to show a home or things like that, and how to include them in the buyer representation agreement. What you'll see is some language that will add either as an addendum or within the body of the buyer representation agreement itself that allows for you as a buyer agent to identify the team members with whom the buyer may be working and who may be compensated, and or unlicensed assistants who may not participate in the compensation that the buyer would be agreeing to pay. Things that continue to come up, and I think I've mentioned this before, is amending the buyer representation agreement. And I thought NAR's position on this has been, well, agreements are generally amendable, for lack of a better word. And so in those situations where you might want to amend the buyer representation agreement, especially as to compensation, that should generally be okay. But I think there's a cautionary tale in their material that they recently released that says, the sole basis for amending the buyer, in fact, I'll just quote it. They say, "You should not amend an agreement for the sole purpose of matching an offer of compensation that is greater than what you and your buyer agreed to." Any amendment must have a legal basis and a fully informed buyer that agrees to amend. And this is, I guess, somewhat consistent with what I've said before, which is, when you sit down and you meet with your buyer for the first time and you agree on a set compensation, and then you find out that a home that they want to submit an offer on may be offering compensation that is greater than that, well, what's the explanation if you're wanting to try to amend your BRA to capture that additional compensation that is being offered by the seller or the seller agent? What's the basis for you to do so? You agreed on X when you sat down with the buyer for the first time. Now you want X plus. Well, what's the plus? What's the basis for the plus? You're going to have some justification that is not simply, well, that's what they're offering, therefore I want more. A couple of things I'll mention, and then I'll circle back to some more FAQs if we don't get relevant questions. But I just want to remind, and this is now kind of moving off of NAR stuff or NAR practice changes stuff. I can't remember the exact date. I think it was late September. The form changes that were approved back in April and were somewhat delayed because of all the rollout of the NAR practice change form changes. So now, as people, just as a reminder, we've got buy-sell agreements with checkboxes for unrepresented buyers and sellers in those situations where you want to disclose that, and have a documentation that shows that the buyer or sometimes the seller is not represented. In addition to that, we now have the unrepresented buyer disclosure and acknowledgement, which I strongly encourage people to use in those situations where you are representing the seller and the buyer decides to go without any type of representation. OPDs, the commercial and the land, were slightly modified to kind of match the changes that were made at the end of last year. I guess it was actually September of last year, to the residential OPD because of the seller's property disclosure law that went into effect on October 1st. And then we've got a new listing agreement, a new buy-sell agreement for rental/income property. And that could be used in situations where, it's an apartment building, it's a single family residence, any property where either it is being used as or intends to be used as post-closing for a rental income. And I think that would probably, you don't have to, but certainly I would take a look at that form for those situations where a buyer may be purchasing it with an intent to operate it as a short-term rental. The reason for that is that there is additional information in both the listing agreement and the buy-sell agreement concerning, rental history, rental agreements, things like that you wouldn't typically ask for in a straight residential transaction. Some additional changes that you'll see, like I said, date to be determined. End of the year is probably a little bit optimistic, but we're pushing hard to make that work. Will be in the buy-sell agreement. Probably this will be an addendum as opposed to language in there, but recognizing that there are a not insignificant number of transactions where the compensation is being addressed on a case-by-case basis in the buy-sell agreement, we will likely create an addendum to be used that would allow for seller or buyer agent compensation to be addressed in the buy-sell agreement. And that will probably include the possibility of increasing that if there's, for example, a seller agent who's offering compensation and the buyer and buyer agent feel that the compensation being offered by the seller agent is inadequate. The addendum will include an option where you can, in effect, say, I want the seller to pay X compensation, which will be an amount that is in addition to and not included within the compensation that the seller agent may be offering. We'll also include, one of the things that comes up as questions, and I've actually got a FAQ video that I'm going to release here, hopefully, if not by the end of the week, early next week, is on, we're putting the buyer agent compensation in the buy-sell agreement, saying that the seller is obligated to pay the buyer agent. The buyer agent isn't a party to that contract. How does that work? And so there's a theory, I've mentioned this quite a few times before, called third-party beneficiaries. And that we'll put some language in there about that obligation for the seller to pay the buyer agent, meaning that the buyer agent is a third-party beneficiary of that agreement, notwithstanding that they're not a party. One of the things that we're hearing from NAR is, you really need to make certain that certain agreements, especially those that address compensation, are clear, concise, and easily understood by the members, or by the public, I'm sorry, and, also by the members. So I think one of the things we'll also be doing, or not I think, one of the things I'll be doing is to try to make the listing agreements and the buyer representation agreements a little bit easier to read, maybe a little more breakup in the paragraphs so that there's not these, long 10-line paragraphs, separating out certain things. Again, exactly how that's going to look, not sure. I'm going to work on drafting some language for the form subcommittee to take a look at, hopefully later next week when we all get back together. One of the other things that's come up quite a bit is removing the buyer's name from the cooperating broker compensation agreement. We discussed this extensively at the meeting a couple of weeks ago and feel that that can be done. Again, I've got to kind of exactly work through the language on that, but that'll ease some people who are concerned about information about the buyer being provided before the buyer has made an offer on the property, in light of desire of some, if not many, to retain the anonymity of the buyer until an offer has been submitted. And like I said earlier, I think the future is a little unknown. We've got 4 years of a new administration starting here in January, and I don't know what that's going to look like as far as the realtors are concerned. But I'm kind of hopeful that it may result in a little less scrutiny by the Department of Justice, not only as to the realtors, but to some of the other organizations they've been focused on recently. We'll see. Last thing, and then I'll jump into some of the questions now that we're approaching 12:30, that I want to mention is, first of all, Montana's, this is a case out of Carbon County that involves short-term rentals. And over the course of the past 5 to 7 years, this has been addressed through legislation that has been introduced, some passed, some not. You're aware of like SB 300, which passed in 2019. But anyways, there's a case out of Carbon County where a buyer purchased a home, made some modifications to the garage to add an accessory dwelling unit with the intention of operating as a short-term rental. The property was subject to covenants. The covenant stated, I quote, "No commercial business, trade, or manufacture of any sort shall be allowed." And in that case, the Montana Supreme Court ruled that covenant, that language, prohibited short-term rentals on the basis that a short-term rental is a business carried on for profit and therefore prohibited by the no commercial business enterprise language. So it's that was a little surprising to me. Some states have looked at this. Montana had not until the case came out, like I said, middle of September of this year. I would not be surprised that we don't see legislation to address this in the upcoming session that starts here in a couple of months. I don't know of any bills right now. Daniel may or may have heard of some that are going to come, but for now, if you've got a buyer who is looking at property to operate as a short-term rental, it is going to be imperative that they carefully look at the covenants. And if there is language of any sort that prohibits commercial activity, it's probably wise to have an attorney take a look at that to determine whether or not the language would prohibit a short-term rental in that situation. Last case, I just want to mention, this is not a Montana case, but it's kind of, it's a little bit different than obviously short-term rentals. But it was a case out of New Mexico, recently decided. The situation was one where the real estate, the listing agent, the buyer of the property had some concerns identified by inspection with the roof and wanted the roof replaced or repaired or something to that effect. The seller agreed to this and attempted to contact a roofing contractor to get the work completed prior to closing, was unable to do so, and the seller agent said they'd take care of it. Seller agent, I don't think they hired somebody, but they located somebody to do the work. At the end of the day, the person was not licensed, the person was not insured. And apparently what happened, due to what happened, probably not qualified. The roofer got up on the roof and did something that caused a fire to start. I'm not really sure what it was. They didn't explain it in the court case, but it destroyed the home. The result was that the seller's insurance company paid the sellers for the destruction of their home caused by this contractor, and then the insurance company sued the seller's agent for a negligent recommendation of this roofer who was, according to the insurance company, not qualified, and the insurance company prevailed. So the reason I bring that up is, in those situations where you're recommending the services of third parties to your clients or even a customer on the other side. For example, you're the seller agent and a buyer wants to do a home inspection. It is incumbent, I think, for you to, if you're, either make sure that the person you're recommending is highly qualified, licensed, and insured where applicable. But even probably more importantly and better, to recommend a handful, like give the buyer or the seller or the person to whom you're making these recommendation choices so that they can choose, as opposed to you hiring that person and taking, and just leaving one person and then having it be a problem, like a home inspector who misses something or a roofer who causes the house to burn down. Okay, so it is 12:30 and I see some questions in both. Maybe what I'll do is, Nicole, I'll turn it over to you to ask the questions and then we can go from there if that's okay.
All right, that will work fine for me. First question is from Joseph. I've had agents ask if we excused ourselves from NAR, would we still have to follow the NAR guidelines? If you're not part of NAR, can you still be a member of your local association and still have access to MLS? It appears agents from other states and regions are removing themselves from NAR.
Oh, there's a lot of answers to that question. I mean, the answer is, if you're not a realtor member or not a participant in the MLS, which does require realtor membership, at least in the state of Montana, you're not obligated to abide by these rules or NAR practice changes, because the NAR practice changes have been incorporated as modifications to the bylaws and the rules of all MLSs in the state of Montana. But if you're not, so you can withdraw from realtor membership. There's some risks in doing so. One being you've got to retain your realtor membership status to be covered by the settlement agreement that was reached up through the date that the class notice is sent out. So that's one thing. And, there's a lot of other things. But the answer to your question is, are you exempt? Are you covered? Are you required, maybe is a better word, to abide by these regulations if you don't participate in a multiple listing service where those changes have been adopted? No, you're not. But, these are changes that have been agreed upon between an organization that probably represents, and I'm just guessing here on a nationwide basis though, 90%, 80 to 90% of all real estate agents. So the mere fact that you wouldn't have to comply with these requirements doesn't mean that somebody couldn't come after you for not doing so if you decided to withdraw from membership in the realtor organization. And of course, I won't get into the weeds on this too much, but you would lose out on a lot of other benefits of realtor membership, at least in the state of Montana, including forums, legal hotline, legislative representation for matters that affect you. So, but yeah, you can withdraw if you like.
All right, Alicia is asking, in a situation where a buyer has signed 3 apples on a buyer representation agreement, but the seller is only offering 2.5, what is the recommended way to structure and phrase that request for the seller to recover the remaining half? Specifically, can this be integrated into the closing cost credit language with the closing costs labeled as covering closing costs, prepaids, and buyer agent compensation?
I'm not, we may have to open that up. I'm looking at these two on the screen here, Nicole. We may have to open that up for Alicia to explain, but you know, generally speaking, if the amount of compensation that is being offered by a listing agent through a cooperative broker compensation agreement, let's say, is less than what you think is appropriate, then you can ask, you can negotiate with that listing agent to try to increase their compensation to the level you think is appropriate. You can ask the seller to make up the difference in the listing, in the buy-sell agreement. You can reduce the amount that the buyer would pay if you feel that the lower amount is adequate. You know, as far as where it would be credited, where it would be handled, I'm not sure I'm understanding that part of the question, but it would be in the I mean, if the seller agreed to make up the difference in the buy-sell agreement, it would be in the closing statement as a debit against the seller's net proceeds. Is that, and maybe Alicia, I don't know if you can do this, but Alicia, does that answer your question? I see you on the screen now.
Yeah. Hi, Jamie. Thank you. So we've had a couple of these where the seller was offering 2.5 and the buyer had a 3%, or I'm sorry, three apple signed and wanted us to try and negotiate the difference. And so we've had it with two different title companies where it really added a big level of confusion as far as how to do it or how to structure it. And I just wanted to reach out and see if we had a standard of practice that would be best served and clear and not confusing for how we're trying to do this.
Yeah, I mean, there is probably not anything right now, but as I indicated, that will be something that will be, well, I say should be, but I think likely will be addressed in the addendum that would be available for you to use. So to just kind of walk it through a hypothetical, if there was, you know, let's say it was 3 apples and that you wanted to be paid by for your services as a buyer agent, the greatest amount that the seller or seller agent would agree to is 2, then you could put into the buy-sell agreement language that would say something like, you know, at closing, seller agrees to pay 1 apple to the agent, to Alicia, the agent representing the buyer, to be deducted from the seller's gross proceeds on the seller's closing costs. You know, not unlike a seller would have the deduction done for the compensation that the seller has agreed to pay to the seller agent. I think this will become a little bit clearer once that addendum is approved and made available to you, because you know, I'm still picturing in my mind exactly what it's going to look like, but I think there will be a checkbox that'll say language similar to what I just mentioned.
Thank you.
And I'm looking at these, Nicole, so I can just run through them if you want. Barb asked regarding forms, will there be a buyer's estimated costs and fees in the future? Not at present, Barb. You know, is that something we might consider somewhere? Maybe. You know, years and years ago, that was a requirement. I can't remember if it was imposed on both the buyer and the seller side, but the Board of Realty Regulation did have a rule that required a seller's estimated net sheet. That rule was repealed many years ago, and since then we took that out of there. I think it just became a little bit difficult to estimate when there are a lot of things you just didn't know at the time of the listing, at least on the seller side of things. You know, as far as, you know, the big thing here, and maybe this is not the question you're asking, Barb, but you know, I don't think it's a bad, notwithstanding that we don't have a form currently and may not ever have a form. It's not required, but I don't think it's a bad idea, you know, especially when you're representing a buyer who may, you know, have some challenges in affording to pay all the costs associated with acquiring a new home, including buyer compensation, is to say, you know, on this, let me give you an example again. So let's just say that the buyer agent compensation and the buyer representation agreement is less than what you have been able to negotiate from the seller or the seller agent, and the buyer still wants to proceed with making an offer on that house. I don't think it would be a bad idea. In fact, it'd probably be a good idea to put something in writing, even if it's just a simple email that says, that's fine. You know, if you want to make an offer on this house, but you need to understand that, you know, you agreed to pay me X, the seller is offering less than X. And so at closing, you will be, in addition to the closing cost you'll have to pay, down payment, what have you, you know, you're going to have to come up with this amount to compensate me, just so that the buyer understands that in making an offer on the house where the seller and the seller agent have not agreed to compensation that matches what you have agreed with your buyer, that there will be this obligation for the buyer to pay you at closing. Again, not required, but I think in the interest of transparency and clarity, it's a good idea. And sometimes it may cause a buyer to rethink whether they want to make an offer on a property where they may have to come out of pocket to fully compensate you the amount that they have agreed to. Next question is, if you have a signed CBCA, cooperating broker compensation agreement, prior to writing a buy-sell, do you as a buyer's agent still need to put compensation in the buy-sell agreement? Absolutely not, right? I mean, if you've got, well, unless, of course, the compensation agreed to in the CBCA is less than what you are agreeable to accept as far as compensation. For example, back to the question a few minutes ago that Alicia asked, you know, that situation where the CBCA amount that the seller agent has been authorized to compensate you is less than what either you're agreeable to take and or that is set forth in the buyer representation agreement. But if the CBCA that you've negotiated and executed on both sides, right, the seller agent side and the buyer agent side, fully compensates you for an amount that you are agreeable to, it is not necessary that you address this in the buy-sell agreement. And by the way, if I'm misunderstanding questions or don't answer the question, I guess whatever mechanism you can do to get Nicole's attention so that she can let you in to ask the question verbally, do that. I don't know if they can raise their hands, Nicole, or what have you.
They can raise their hands, Jaymie.
Okay, thanks, Shanna. So yeah, so if I apologize if I may not answer a question, or like, as I said earlier, you've got a question that is just far too difficult to put into words or at least type into words, raise your hands. I mean, for the time being, I'm going to continue to kind of scroll through some of the questions that I see in the Q&A section. Question from Anita: if a buyer rep has 2.5, but seller is offering 3, what happens to the half that is not paid? I mean, unless it's addressed, there's nothing that specifically states what happens to compensation that is that a seller has authorized that is greater than what a buyer agent has requested. You know, I think that's one of the things we may try to clarify in the I'll call it a revamp. I don't want to scare everybody and think we're going to completely rewrite the listing contract, because that's certainly not our intention. But we may address this. But I'll say this: under the current structure of our listing agreements, you know, what it states is that seller agrees to pay seller agent X, and that's what the seller agent gets. Out of that, the seller agent is agreeing to pay Y as selling office compensation. Well, if Y is less than what a buyer, you know, than what the seller has authorized, then, you know, under our current listing contract, the seller agent gets to recover that. But I think it is incredibly important to have that conversation, because there are going to be situations where, for example, there may not be a buyer agent. And, you know, I think I would want to have a conversation with the seller that says something about, you know, clearly, where you've clearly discussed what happens, you know, if it's 6 apples or 5 apples, the seller's agreeing to pay. and the seller's authorizing, let's just say hypothetically, half of that to be offered a compensation, and there's nobody to accept that compensation because there's no buyer agent, what happens to the balance? I mean, you can make an argument that in those situations that where a buyer is unrepresented, you're going to have to do more work. It's going to be more difficult, and you should keep that, or at least most of it. So that's something that I think you should be addressing with your seller, and depending upon what you feel is appropriate. But understand that on the listing contract, whatever amount the seller is paying to you is what you get. And, you know, whatever difference, whatever you pay out, you keep the difference. Megan had a question about the class action part of the buyer broker agreement. Yeah, I will explain that. And here's what I'll tell you is, you know, so the intent of that language that was added to both the buyer representation agreement as well as all the listing contracts was to contractually have your client, your buyer or your seller, waive the right to bring a class action lawsuit, not unlike the one that we all know about where the verdict was rendered on Halloween of last year. I think that has questionable enforceability. I think it has caused a lot of concerns amongst buyers. It's not, and sellers, when they see that, it's not great optics. And so that language will be removed from we have agreed, the form subcommittee has agreed to remove that language from the buyer representation and the listing contracts, and it will no longer be in there. Elizabeth has a question. When amending, is it okay to amend down but not up? And this is a question that was asked, and the answer is to Elizabeth, yeah, certainly, right? If you have a buyer representation agreement and it says X and the best that you can get out of the seller is less than X, can you and the buyer agree to amend your buyer representation agreement to match that which the seller and or seller agent is offering? Absolutely. And I don't want to say you can't amend up. You can, with the cautionary tale that I provided from NAR just at the beginning of this Zoom call. As far as how to do it, I think, you know, what I would do in the amendment that you prepare is just make certain that it's tied to a specific property. And, you know, I'm loath to kind of give you the exact language, but something to the effect of, you know, buyer and buyer agent agree that related to the purchase of the property at 123 Main Street, buyer agent agrees to reduce their compensation to X, but that this reduction in compensation shall only apply to 123 Main Street if the buyer proceeds and not if buyer looks at other property or something to that effect. Okay, Barb, do you have any perspective on BRR and if they make any changes with the licensing related to the NAR settlement? You know, Barb, I don't. Not the most recent Board of Realty meeting, which was a couple of weeks ago, but at one that I think was in August, the then executive director of the Board of Realty, and there is a new one now, indicated that he didn't feel that there was any necessity to make any regulatory changes, any rule changes based on the NAR settlement. At the meeting a couple of weeks ago, that was not mentioned either, or there was nothing mentioned about making any rule changes. That doesn't mean that they may not do something in the future, but you know, the only thing that I can imagine that they might do would be to bring the Board of Realty rules in line with respect to buyer representation agreements, in line with the requirement that it be executed prior to touring a home in a residential property. But you know, I don't think that's going to happen. But never say never. Question from Elizabeth about the BRA requirement for having execution prior to showing. Does it apply only to residential, or is it required for land, commercial, etc.? The answer is it applies only to residential. However, understand that by residential, it is anything between 1 and 4 units. So it's not gonna apply to land, it's generally not gonna apply to commercial, but if you've got a fourplex, it would apply to that. A fourplex where the use of the property is residential in nature, I should clarify. Okay, Curtis's question, the listing agreement, I'm assuming, obligates the seller to pay 6, sign the CBCA, and it says the seller pays 2.5 to buy. I don't know that I understand the question there, Curtis, so I may, So Curtis's question is, if the listing agreement says 6% and the cooperating broker compensation agreement says 2.5, isn't that equal 8.5? The answer is no, because the cooperating broker compensation agreement is not an agreement whereby the seller is agreeing to pay. It is an agreement whereby the seller agent is agreeing to pay. The CBCA is an agreement between a seller agent and a buyer agent. It's agent to agent compensation. So what's going to be set forth in the CBCA, whatever dollar amount or percentage amount that is in there, is going to be included within, pursuant to the terms of the listing contract, the percentage the seller has agreed to pay. Rita has a question about whether conflicting advice and whether we should request compensation on the CBCA instead of the buy-sell agreement and vice versa. Do I recommend one over the other? You know, Rita, at this point in time, I don't recommend one over the other. My recommendation is that you have something in writing before or in conjunction with the presentation of an offer. So, if you, for example, if you're representing a buyer and the buyer wants to submit an offer, and at the point in time that the buyer is ready to submit an offer, that you have not been able to reach an agreement with the listing agent as far as compensation, then address it in the buy-sell agreement. If you are able to reach an agreement and the seller has authorized compensation to be paid by the selling agent, then you can use the CBCA. That said, I do know that there are corporate brokerages out there that have either prohibited or strongly recommended against using agent to agent compensation. I've heard that decision may have increasing popularity amongst other large brokerages, franchisors, if you will. I just got a voicemail in this regard yesterday afternoon, so I'm looking into that. But at this point in time, and I've not seen anything from NAR, I'm trying to see if I can participate in the risk management issue committee meeting, which is Friday via Zoom. Obviously, I'm sitting in Missoula, Montana. I'm not headed to Boston to see whether NAR has any further insights on that. But at this point in time, from a legal standpoint, there is nothing wrong with, there's nothing prohibited by, there's no law that or settlement agreement or policy that prohibits you from using one or the other. And I think ultimately, for now, unless I update you or we get some significant information from NAR, Department of Justice, whatever the case may be, it's just going to have to depend on what agreement you have reached with the seller. If the seller wants, as I said, to retain flexibility in the compensation that they're willing to pay, probably best to use the buy-sell agreement. If the seller is willing to pay a fixed amount in cooperating compensation, regardless of what the offer is, then you can, do it through the CBCA. Marcy has a question. I've run into agents submitting offers with both compensation written in the contract as seller paid cost and also submitting a CBCA. Isn't that asking them to get paid twice? Yeah, I mean, in theory, that is right. If the seller agent says, if the seller agrees in the listing agreement to pay the seller agent, and the seller agent agrees in the CBCA to pay the buyer, and then on top of that, the seller agrees to pay, the buyer agent, and then on top of that, the seller agrees to pay the buyer agent in the buy-sell agreement, somebody could theoretically at least make the argument that both contracts are independent and have to be adhered to, and therefore the payment made. I think it's therefore important, back to kind of the earlier question, to make certain that you're kind of focusing on one or the other. If, you know, if you've got, unfortunate as it may be, if you've got a listing agreement that authorizes you as a listing agent to pay compensation and the buy-sell agreement brings it up, then, you know, what you're probably going to have to do is have a conversation with your seller and perhaps even amend the listing contract to say, hey, if you want to accept this compensation proposal in the buy-sell agreement, then we need to amend the listing contract to reduce that by the amount you're agreeing to in the buy-sell agreement. I know it's awkward, it's cumbersome, but you know, that's kind of what you have to do. I mean, the other alternative would be to just counter to the buy-sell agreement and say no on the compensation, and in conjunction with the counteroffer that says no compensation in the buy-sell agreement, send over the CBCA that covers it. That may be the easier way to do it. Jamie has a question about the leftover apple question. If the listing agreement says we are cooperating with the buyer's agent and paying them 3 apples and we only give them 2.5 apples because that is what the BRA dictates, are we in breach of the listing contract? Well, no, right? Because what the listing contract does, it authorizes you to pay up to. And so, you know, if you're going to pay less than what the seller has authorized to you under the terms of the listing contract, you technically get to keep the difference. It's not unlike pre-NAR practice changes, right? Where you had, you know, a listing agreement that had 5 apples and the buyer was unrepresented, and you weren't going to represent the buyer, you know, you would get to keep the entire compensation that you agreed to with your seller, unless you agreed to a variable rate commission, which was sometimes not uncommon. I think, you know, the fact that these questions are being asked is just kind of leads me to believe that, you know, this needs to be clarified in the listing contract, and that's one of the things that, as I indicated, that we're going to do is to try to break that out. I mean, one of the things I'll mention as an aside is at the most recent NAR, not legal forum, but every month or so we have a Zoom call with NAR's legal team, the attorneys, that is, who represent realtor organizations around the country. And, you know, they were pretty adamant that, you know, we really need to be working on making certain that we're writing our forms in a manner that is not solely to benefit the members of the realtor organization, and that makes certain that they are clear and concise for the public. And so that is one of the things I'll think we'll do, including trying to clarify these situations where, you know, the what happens with the excess that has been authorized. Megan's question is, if the buyer broker is X apples and the cooperation is for more apples and those are separate agreement, why doesn't the buyer agent get the larger amount in the cooperation agreement, since it will not affect the buyer? Well, the reason for that is, Megan, is because it's expressly prohibited by the terms of the settlement. You know, you cannot have a buyer representation agreement that simply says well, one, you cannot be paid more than what your buyer representation agreement states. That is a express and clear term of the settlement agreement, and therefore an express and clear term of the NAR practice changes. And you can't have language, and similarly, you can't have language in the buyer representation agreement that says that, you know, something like, you will pay me 2 apples or whatever a seller or seller agent is offering, whichever is greater. That is equally as prohibited by the terms of the settlement and the NAR practice changes. So that's why you can't do that. Jamie says, if the listing agreement doesn't say up to percentages, says equal, this is back to the greater of. Yeah, but remember, this is an authorization, right? This is an authorization for you to pay, which, you know, doesn't mean that you have to pay that amount. I mean, especially if it's a situation where you might be willing to forego or refund or reduce the amount that your seller pays. But I will acknowledge, Jamie, and everybody, that this is one of the concerns I have with our listing agreement, is that it creates some confusion and lack of clarity in those situations where the seller has authorized selling office compensation to be paid, but the authorization is less than the amount that will be paid. What happens to the difference? And we need to do better at explaining what'll happen, and we will. And Megan, I'm not understanding your question that you just sent in a few minutes ago, and we're getting close to time. So I guess, you
Jamie,
wanna
we do
let
have one individual that's raised their hand quite a while ago.
raise their hand in the chat room or, oh,
And the
okay. Oh, raise their hand.
participants,
Yeah.
Mona
Okay, go
Munson
ahead.
did.
Go ahead with that, Shanna.
Okay,
Mona, go ahead.
Hello, sir. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I believe you kind of answered this, but it was really confusing at the convention forum. I think his name was Mark that sat on the panel, and he was going over his practices as a buyer's on the buyer's contract agreement. And he said that I put in that it can be, if this doesn't happen, it can be renegotiated. And everything you taught us said that it needed to be a firm amount. And I was surprised that you didn't challenge that, or am I wrong?
Yeah. Vaguely recall that was here in Missoula, Mona, what you're talking
Yes.
about? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I kind of vaguely recall that, and just maybe just to kind of put some clarification on there, I think what you're talking about is, all right, you've got a buyer representation agreement that says that the buyer's gonna pay you X. But then you also add language that says, but if the seller or seller agent is offering more than X, buyer agrees. In the buyer representation agreement, there is language that says buyer agrees to renegotiate with the buyer agent to increase the amount that the buyer agent has to pay. Is that what you're saying, asking about?
Yeah, and I guess that's confusing to me because I always thought on all the meetings that I sat on that we couldn't have it negotiated, that we had to have a firm amount for the buyer to know.
You do, right? It has to be readily ascertainable. The question is, it specifically is, can you amend the buyer representation agreement for a higher dollar amount? Or even better yet, or more, I would say more aggressively and therefore more riskily, can you put language in there that says the buyer will agree? I would not put language in there
agree.
that says the buyer will agree to renegotiate or increase the amount. And part of that is, is that expressly prohibited by the terms of the settlement or the practice changes? It is not. But, and I know I've mentioned this before, when California first released their buyer representation agreement after the settlement agreement was announced, the Consumer Federation of America hired a law professor out of New York to do a paper that was very, very critical of many aspects of the California buyer representation agreement, and very specifically that language. So we have elected not to include that language in our buyer representation agreement. I don't think we will ever add that language to your buyer representation agreement. And I would suggest to you that I probably would not do that. But, I can't tell you that it is black letter law that you can't. I just wouldn't.
Okay. And to clarify, if you put just maybe renegotiated, not put if it needs to be raised. Can you just put if buyer agrees this may be renegotiated?
Well, and I don't say this critically, Mona, but what's to do what renegotiated to do what? I mean, what would you possibly
Well,
renegotiate
it
but for
pertains to the
compensation?
fee. The fee.
Yeah, right.
It
But I
was
mean,
just so confusing hearing him. And
yeah, again, I'm not the police of what you put in there, but I would tell you what I think is not a good idea, and what I'm telling you is
thank you.
that's one of the things that I don't think is a good idea.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. I see there's a number of other questions still in the Q&A, but it is 1 o'clock. So what's the plan here, ladies there in Helena?
Jamie, I will leave that up to you.
Okay, well, let me try to address maybe a couple of them, but we've got 7 open questions and I don't have the time right now to get through all of them. So I'll I'm trying to just kind of scroll through here.
Okay,
Yeah, and so Barb had some questions about the listening agreement. It'd be nice to have a total professional fee not to exceed. Well, you have to be careful there about not to exceed, because that doesn't really clearly specify, perhaps to the extent necessary as set forth in the settlement agreement, what the compensation is that the seller is agreeing to. I will say this with respect to the agreements. I know this is new, and I know we being the form subcommittee and MAR in general knew that the first shot at making these changes was not going to be perfect, and that but we wanted to give it a test run. And so, what I would encourage you all to do is just sit tight. I think, we've got the message loud and clear that we need to clarify certain areas, some of which have been brought up on numerous occasions today, and I'm confident we will. It may take a number of go rounds. While the situation with respect to the terms of the settlement and the NIR practice changes are now well known, the situation around the country is still a little bit dynamic. There are still things going on, so there may be additional changes that are warranted either by outside forces or internally of things that we still think. So, I guess what I'm trying to say in a long, short way is trust us. We're going to try to do what's best for the membership, while at the same time making certain that we're doing so in a manner that is puts you at the least amount of risk, is compliant with the requirements as we see it, and that provides clear information and decisions to be made by the public, who are your clients, as they're executing this documents. I think I'm going to stop it there. I guess if there's still questions that are significant, I know in the past, Karen has either suggested that you send them, or we've printed off the Q&A session. And if there's some additional questions that I didn't address today, what I can try to do is add those to the FAQs and post them up on the MAR website.
Jamie, I do have copies of the final questions and I'll send those to you.
That'd be great, Shanna. Thank you very, very much.
You're welcome.
So, am I right too, Shanna, that this is the last Broker Power Hour for 2024?
That is my understanding.
Okay, well, I'll leave y'all with this. I think everybody's doing a great job in adapting to some of these changes. I understand it's not easy. This is probably the most significant modification we've seen to the practice of real estate in all of your lifetimes, or at least in your real estate licensing lifetimes. But MAR are carefully monitoring this. We have great representation at the NAR meetings that are taking place right now in Boston. And as we gather more information, we will continue to keep you apprised and do anything necessary to make certain that our forms are modified accordingly. And I just appreciate all of you for your patience and the excellent questions that you ask, and have a good day.